A man spending the day along the shores of a lake in eastern Manitoba. An amateur geologist, he was looking for quartz and other interesting items. The birds around him start to get agitated. He sees some objects just meters away and has no idea why they're there. One flies off while the other remains. The incident would leave him with scars and a lifetime of questions about what had happened. Everyone from the RCMP to the Canadian Air Force and even the Americans wanted to talk to him about what had happened. To this day, there are still discussions about whether or not what happened to him on that May afternoon in 1967 were real. Later that same year in Nova Scotia, something crashed into the waters off the coast of Shag Harbour. It was believed to possibly be an airplane that had ditched into the water, and people would scramble to the scene to assist in a rescue operation. The problem was, there was no debris, no survivors, no bodies, nothing. And to further make things confusing, no aircraft were ever reported to have gone missing in that area. Two incidents, months apart, that involved unidentified aircraft. To this day, many have wondered if they were visitors from another planet or not. We will look at these two particular incidents in this week's episode of Canadian History After Dark. Throughout the history of Canada, certain events are always highlighted and are well enshrined in our collective memory, be it the War of 1812, the Battle of Vimy Ridge, the creation of Canada in 1867, or the 1972 Summit Series. However, there is so much more to our history and the history of the land before Canada existed. This podcast endeavors to tell those stories, looking at chapters of our history that may be regionally well known and not necessarily well known nationwide. And while much of the history of Canada is solidly rooted in fact, there are a number of stories which leave more questions than answers. And these are just as much a part of the history of Canada. These are mysteries, legends, myths, and stories that shiver the soul. And we will be telling one of those stories today. Welcome to Canadian History After Dark. We will go first to Falcon Lake, Manitoba. The lake is in the middle of Whiteshell Provincial Park in Manitoba, near the border with Ontario, north of the Trans-Canada Highway. Of interesting note is the park is also home to West Hawk Lake, which contains the White Hawk crater, formed by a meteorite that crashed into the Earth around 350 million years ago. On May 20th, 1967, Stefan Michalak, or Steve as he was also called, went to the park to search for quartz and silver near the lake. He had staked a claim to search for precious metals, and it was the Victoria Day long weekend when he went. While he was there, looking for a quartz vein that could yield some precious metals such as gold, he heard a noise behind him. A flock of geese became agitated and flew off. An object had startled them, and Michalak turned to investigate. He saw two objects in the sky, and they were glowing an intense red. They started to move lower to the ground, in unison, until one stopped and hovered. The other would move to the ground, landing close to where Michalak stood. The other craft waited until the descending one had made contact with the ground and then started to ascend. The craft that had landed was around 200 feet away from Michalak. He started to approach it, honestly believing that the craft was likely an experimental American aircraft that was performing exercises in the area. He took his time observing the object and even made a sketch of it. His sketch, which he made annotations on of what he was seeing, showed a craft that was round and about 35 to 40 feet in diameter. He estimated it to stand around 15 feet tall. Michalak started to approach it cautiously. He observed that it didn't have any sort of insignia, and that there weren't any seams for doors, parts of the craft, and so forth. The color of the vehicle also changed. He noted it shifted color from gray to red, similar to how stainless steel changes color when heated up, and the scent of sulfur was also noted. He noticed that there was a door of some sort open on one side of the craft, and he could hear what he thought were voices from inside. He called out in English and offered to help them, as it appeared that they were having some sort of malfunction. Being an industrial mechanic, if they were, it was rather lucky that he happened to be there. When he didn't hear a response, he called out again in Polish, then in Russian. He then called out in German, offering his assistance. No reply. Michalak went closer to the craft, putting on the welding goggles he had bought for protection for his eyes while he was chipping away at the rocks. The craft appeared empty as he looked inside the open door, but he saw beams of light and panels that were flashing various colors. He touched the craft, and it was so hot it melted the fingertips of his gloves. The door then suddenly closed. The craft turned, and a panel with a grid of holes was directly in front of him. A blast of heated gas struck him with enough force it knocked him back, and the heat was such his clothes started on fire. He began to immediately tear the clothing off as the aircraft flew up and away. McCalloch became almost instantly nauseous. He started to get a throbbing headache. He started sweating and vomited on the ground. He threw down his jacket and began through the bush back towards the town site. There was something very, very wrong. When McCalloch was staggering back to the hotel, he ran into an RCMP officer, Constable Solotki. In his report, Solotki noted he believed McCalloch was drunk, but he couldn't smell any alcohol on him. The officer states he offered to assist McCalloch, but this was refused. And McCalloch, in his recounting of the incident, said the officer was dismissive and didn't offer him any aid. Nonetheless, McCalloch made it back to the hotel, and he asked about the local doctor. The person behind the front desk of the hotel told him the doctor wasn't in town. The next option for him was to return home to Winnipeg. He called his wife and told her he was coming home on the next Greyhound bus. He arrived in the city and was met at the bus depot by his son. He was then taken to the emergency room at the Misericordia Health Center. The injuries he suffered would see him hospitalized for a number of days. He had burns on his chest and stomach that resembled his claims of the panel that ejected the hot gas towards him. While he was in hospital, the story would make its way to the Winnipeg Tribune, and from there it would spread. Within days, investigators would be on the scene to determine what really happened. In an interview on May 23rd, 3 days after the incident, McCalloch told Hubert Beyer of the Winnipeg Free Press, quote, "I still don't feel too well. Not only have I lost 12 pounds in these 2 days, I still vomit, and I can still feel a sort of foul smell coming from inside me," unquote. Many noted the injuries suffered by McCalloch were consistent with radiation poisoning. As the investigators came to the scene, things turned into a full-blown hunt. Military helicopters were surveying the area, with one from the Army and another from the Air Force. The RCMP also joined in on the search. As much as they combed the area, though, they were unable to find anything, as the details from McCalloch were vague. He was unable to join them due to his health. Still, they needed him to help. 2 RCMP officers drove to McCalloch's house and picked him up to help with the search for the location. At first, they took him up in a helicopter, but he was unable to find anything. Then they tried on the ground, but they couldn't find the exact location. Was this all a hoax to cover up something that happened while McCalloch was drunk? Was there even a real UFO? It turns out he wasn't the only person who reportedly saw anything. In the Winnipeg Free Press on May 23rd, it was reported 2 other people had seen the crafts as well. There were also reports a server from the hotel, while out with her boyfriend, had seen a silver object in the sky that had appeared to follow them as they tried to evade it to return home. We now go to the investigation itself. On May 23rd, the Canadian Forces took the report, and it was noted that a responsible officer should be assigned to investigate, which at that time was called a UFO report by the federal government. By May 26th, the deputy base surgeon at Westwind, Manitoba, had been in contact with the physician who had treated McCalloch. In a memorandum sent to the officer in charge of the investigation, Squad Leader P. Biskey, the surgeon noted at no time was the physician aware of the circumstances surrounding the burns. The surgeon added, quote, "At examination, the physician found an area of first-degree burns over the upper abdomen, covering an area of 7 to 8 inches and consisting of several round and irregular-shaped burns the size of a silver dollar or less. These were a dull red in color. The hair over the lower chest was singed, as was the hair on the forehead, with some questionable redness of the right cheek and temple." Unquote. As for the possibility of radiation poisoning, it was noted that his clothes and blood tested negative for radiation. The case also attracted the attention of the United States, with a committee from the University of Colorado expressing interest in the situation. In late June, when he was feeling much better, McCalloch was able to return to the scene, recalling where it was. He located the site and notified Squad Leader Biskey on June 26th of the site. He also advised he had recovered his burned shirt and some of the moss from the area. However, this was where some people started to wonder about the validity of the claims. Just 90 minutes after the phone call from McCalloch to Biskey, the officer, along with a constable from the RCMP, visited the McCalloch residence. In the report, it was noted that McCalloch was surprised the RCMP were there. As well, McCalloch had returned to the site with someone called Mr. Hart, who was a complete stranger to McCalloch. This went against what he had previously said to Corporal Davis of the RCMP, that he would have the RCMP or military go with him in any attempts to relocate the site so that any findings could be corroborated. When asked to provide the location of the site, McCalloch refused to do so until his land claim could be filed, as he didn't want anyone to jump the claim. The situation seemed odd. There were some samples that were in McCalloch's basement collected from the area that Biskey examined. The RCMP officer, however, was not invited to inspect these samples. In the report, it was noted, quote, "He permitted the samples to be tested for magnetic field, and each of the larger section of ore had a reaction on a handheld compass. Smaller particles were subject to pick up by a small magnet which Mr. McCalloch had in the basement. From an uninitiated amateur viewpoint, this would indicate the very high metal concentration in the two samples. In fact, both samples looked like crystallized metal. Asked if he, Mr. McCalloch, thought that there may be any uranium or radioactive material in the samples, Mr. McCalloch stated that he would have recognized it immediately had there been any present." Unquote. We mentioned a few moments ago how the University of Colorado had expressed an interest in the case. Professor Roy Craig was the UFO project officer there, and on June 5th he paid a visit to Biskey after talking with the McCalloch family. In the report, the visit between Craig and Biskey was recounted, noting, quote, "At this time, Professor Craig voiced his doubts as to the authenticity of this report and felt that Mr. McCalloch had perhaps been subjected to hallucinations, cause or causes of which could possibly be attributed to past experiences. He, too, indicated disappointment at Mr. McCalloch's apparent lack of directional know-how while searching in the bush." Unquote. All of the reports, however, continued to note that the injuries suffered by McCalloch, particularly the burns, were still unexplainable. The samples that Biskey was allowed to take from McCalloch were sent away for the radiation testing, and the results were quite shocking. In a report from the RCMP Crime Lab in Ottawa, dated July 26, 1967, it states, quote, "The report from Dr. Booth indicates a radiation value of 0.3 microcuries in the soil sample. Dr. Booth reports that the radiation is from a radium source and is a possible serious health hazard. He is sending an investigator to the Falcon Lake area." Unquote. A follow-up memo dated on September 5th said that the official investigation shows the soil samples provided by McCalloch were only a portion of the soil he had collected, and the amount of radiation may be extremely high, which meant that it may be necessary for public safety to obtain the rest of the soil from McCalloch. Further investigation, however, determined the levels were not high enough to necessarily pose a radiation hazard to the general public. The source of the contamination, however, continued to be speculated. The task force helmed by Biskey was investigating every possible source for the radiation, including McCalloch's employer, as well as going to places such as burial sites for disposed radium, and even checking at the hospital. Nothing came up. McCalloch would continue to be plagued by the injuries he received, with the burns reportedly returning every 120 days. He would go on to write a book, in Polish and in English, about the incident. After initially embracing some of the media attention, he started to withdraw from it, and reportedly stated he regretted going public as the years went on. McCalloch passed away in 1999, and reportedly still believed that the UFO he saw was an experimental aircraft from Earth, not from a far-off planet. Now let's look at some of the skepticism surrounding the case. Many have held that the burns suffered came about during an incident when McCalloch was drunk. While he always stated that he wasn't drunk at the time of the incident and that he rarely touched alcohol, during one of the visits to the landing site with the investigation team from the Air Force, they took him out for some drinks. It was during this excursion that McCalloch had several cocktails with the group and became a lot more talkative. However, he still stuck to the basics of the story. Some of the details, though, changed with different retellings. Some of the items found at the site a year after the incident were also purported to be from the craft, melted radioactive metal. The problem was the metal was determined to have gained its radioactivity from uranium powder from northern Saskatchewan. The timing was also a year to the day from the original incident. After all of the investigations, though, including by the Department of National Defense, the National Research Council, and the RCMP, it was determined that the investigators were unable to provide any evidence which could dispute the story put forward by McCulloch. To this day, it remains a question as to whether the incident ever really happened. Now, in the fall of 1967, another incident involving a UFO was reported, but this time thousands of kilometers away. The night of October 4th would see a number of reports of an unusual object in the sky and a search and rescue operation for a suspected crashed plane. However, nothing was quite as it seemed. The incident really started around 7:15 p.m. Eastern Time, when an Air Canada flight reported a strange object on the left side of the plane around Sherbrooke, Quebec. It was described by the pilots of the plane as a rectangular object. 4 minutes after initially observing it, they would see a silent explosion near the object and then a second explosion 2 minutes later. As the evening went on, more sightings were reported, especially in the Nova Scotia area. Daryl Dorey of Mahone Bay wrote to the commander of the RCAF Greenwood base on the 5th, stating himself, his sister, and his mother had seen a large object flying around the southwestern horizon. The captain of the MV Nickerson, Leo Howard Mercy, also reported seeing something in the sky. In his report, filed with the RCMP, he stated, quote, "At about 9 p.m. on the 4th of October, I noticed an object with 3 flashing red lights. Radar indicated this object to be 16 miles away. It was very clear that night, and we could see the lights of Halifax. At the time, our boat was 32 miles southeast of the Sambro Light, and the object was approximately 16 miles northeast of us. I would say the object was 16 miles southeast of Sambro. At times, the Navy do a lot of practicing in the area. At the same time, there were 3 other objects on the radar, and about 6 miles from the first object. I would say it disappeared about 11 p.m. because it went right up in the air. I could not see any shape or form to it because of the distance. When it went into the air, it only had 1 flashing light. While the object was on the water or close to the water, it had 3 real bright flashing red lights. All the lights on it were red. I could not see any lights on the other 3 objects as they were only appearing on the radar. It is not unusual to see the Navy or aircraft dropping things into the water there. I had never seen anything like that before, but it sounds like the thing they are looking for down off Shelburne or Burrington Passage. When the object left, it went straight up in the air with only 1 red light." Unquote. Around the same time, newsrooms and radio stations and newspapers in Halifax started receiving calls from people who were reporting seeing strange glowing things flying around Halifax. Now, remember how Mercy in his report to the RCMP mentioned looking for something off Shelburne? Around 11:30 p.m., it was reported that something had crashed into the waters of Shag Harbour, right near Shelburne. Around 11 people had seen the aircraft hit the water, and frantic calls went into the RCMP concerning what had happened. One of those who had witnessed the object hit the water, Laurie Wickens, noted that it was floating around 900 feet from shore. Within 15 minutes, the RCMP were on the scene. The local detachment radioed as well to the Rescue Coordination Center in Halifax. Before they could arrive, though, the object started to sink from view. Right away, a rescue mission started, at first with local fishing boats. No debris, survivors, or bodies would surface, however. The Rescue Coordination Center confirmed that there were no airplanes reported as missing, commercial, private, or military. No one could say for certain what had crashed into the waters just off the southwest coast of Nova Scotia. The Navy sent a detachment of divers to comb the seafloor, looking for the aircraft, but nothing was found. Now, in 2022, there are just a few documents of the sighting that are available in the archives through the internet. One of the reports, which is available through the Library and Archives of Canada, reads, quote, "An RCMP corporal and 6 other witnesses observed what they believed to be an unidentified flying object off the southwest coast of Nova Scotia on the 4th of October. The object was described as approximately 60 feet in length and was flying in an easterly direction when first sighted. During their observation, the UFO descended rapidly to the surface and made a bright splash as it struck the water. For some time after the impact, a single white light remained on the surface. The RCMP corporal endeavored to reach the floating white object, but unfortunately, before he could reach the location, the object sank. A search of the area failed to produce any material evidence which could assist in explaining or establishing the identity of the object. An underwater search conducted by divers from the Department of National Defense also failed to locate any tangible evidence which could be used to arrive at an explainable conclusion. No one could explain what had happened that night in Nova Scotia. However, it is still discussed to this day. It is worth noting that in the 1960s, the Canadian Armed Forces would actually classify reported UFO sightings as Class A, Class B, or Class C. Class A would be an incident that is interesting and worth investigating. Class B would be interesting but not worthy of further investigation, and Class C would be everything else. Only 5 sightings in 1967 would fall under the Class A designation, with 3 of them being eventually explained. To this day, the Shag Harbour and Falcon Lake incidents remain unexplained. The whole discussion about whether or not life exists on other planets, and whether they have visited us here on Earth, has been ongoing for centuries. There are woodcuts from Europe in the 1400s that appear to depict, over the skies of Germany, a galactic battle. There are stories from South Asia tell of similar stories. There are stories passed down by some indigenous nations over the telling of star people that have visited. The concepts of UFOs and aliens isn't new. Perhaps now may be a little bit more prevalent, but definitely not new. Now, I will say it is worth noting that in a day and age when nearly everyone has a smartphone with a decent camera in their pocket, the number of incidents and sightings appears to be on the decline, at least from what I have seen. I know that we focus on history, that is things that happened more than 20 years ago on this podcast, but it is worth pulling some recent numbers. In 2020, there were over 1,200 sightings of UFOs in Canada, which was up by nearly 50% from 2019. But people also had a lot more free time on their hands in 2020 to spend looking at the skies. Myself, I don't doubt that there are other inhabited planets out there. And yes, there are always things that are seen in the sky that we can't explain. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's aliens visiting from another planet. But what do you think? Let us know and take part in the conversations on our Facebook page or on our other social media platforms. Coming up on Sunday on Canadian History with Stephen Wilson, we will be continuing our look at the War of 1812. We are now at the story which is a source of pride for so many Canadians, but our involvement is more myth than anything else. This week, we look at the Chesapeake campaign, which includes the burning of Washington. We also have a special episode coming up on Friday. Jamie Neugebauer is back to talk about the Treaty of Ghent, which brought about the end of the War of 1812. The negotiations for the treaty were just getting underway around the same time of the events that we'll be talking about on Sunday. And next Wednesday, in our next episode of Canadian History After Dark, we will talk about the mystery man of Baie Sainte-Marie. Like and follow us on social media. This includes Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter. Every day we bring you our This Date in Canadian History feature, plus a lot more. Check out our YouTube and become a subscriber. We will be bringing more and more video content in the coming weeks. Speaking of video content, we're also working on a Kickstarter for our documentary series to tell some of the stories of Canada that are better told visually than just by audio. You can also support us on Patreon, and we also have a GoFundMe to help support our endeavors. And of course, follow along the podcast on your favorite platform. We bring you 2 episodes a week. One is Canadian History After Dark, and the other is our ongoing anthology series that looks at various events from Canadian history that may not be as well known nationwide as they are regionally. And thank you for listening to Canadian History After Dark.